Hey, this is Gina Grad.
Hi, this is Teresa Strasser.
Hi, everyone. This is Mike Errico.
Hey there. This is Casey Cavalier.
I'm Rocky Rose.
And you are listening to The Jay Franze Show.
Lucky you.
Welcome to The Jay Franze Show. A behind-the-curtain look at the entertainment industry with insights you can't pay for and stories you've never heard. Now, here's your host, Jay Franze.
Well, hello and welcome to the show. I am Jay Franze, and if you are new here, this is where we take a deep dive into the entertainment industry to provide you with valuable insights and entertaining stories. This week, we get to talk to an amazing comedian. We get to talk to Tom Clark. We'll talk to him about how he got a start in comedy, the development of his character C.L. Thomas, and we'll take a deep dive into the making of his album, Coast to Coast Comedy. Now, Tom is a fellow New Englander living in the great state of Maine. He cut his teeth doing stand-up in Boston, so I'm really excited to talk to him tonight. So if you'd like to join in, comment, or fire off any questions, please head over to jayfranze.com. Now let's get started. Tom, sir, how are you?
Yay, me. I am alive and well, Jay. Thank you for having me.
Sir, it is my pleasure. I am so excited for tonight. I would like to just jump in, okay? So what inspired you to be a comedian in the first place?
Let's see. My standard answer is that I was a butthead all my life, and I decided to get paid for it.
Nice.
But I'm also the classic last of six kids. Moved around a lot as a child, so either make them laugh in the playground or get your butt kicked.
No, I can understand that.
I had an ear that I didn't know about until about middle school, junior high, of that I could impersonate people. And I lived down in Maryland in my junior high years, and I found out there was a couple of the farmers that we worked for, and one had a pretty good Southern accent. Now looking back at it, he was the same clip accent as Jimmy Carter. His name was Daniel Charles, and I could impersonate him by not opening my mouth all the way up the way I later did on stage with Jimmy Carter, because as long as you keep your mouth very closed, then you could pull off a Georgia accent, I believe. And the word important was always with a D. Jimmy Carter said it was always very important not to look at my ugly daughter Amy. Was one of my
Being from Boston and you being from Maine, sir, we can't comment on accents too much.
That's true. It's just that those other voices, that's what I make a living at. So.
It's funny. I see all these videos of people trying to pronounce cities from Massachusetts, and it just never goes well.
Yeah. Well, you were saying the town that you lived in would be spelled Peabody.
Peabody, yeah.
And around there, it's Peabody.
Peabody, yeah.
And I lived when I was breaking into stand-up in Boston, I lived in the suburbs of Woburn, which somebody would have said Woburn, but it was actually Woburn.
Woburn, yeah. The one that gets my wife is Worcester.
Worcester, oh yeah, Worcester. Yeah. Spelled Worcester, pronounced Worcester. How? How does that work?
Yeah, that's where I saw Stephen Wright, was at the Worcester Centrum.
Oh, really? Okay. Because there was a stand-up club that was one of the hell gigs. It was a very nice restaurant, but it was right outside the Centrum. It was called the Plums. We did it upstairs in the corner, but upstairs had a hole that looked downstairs. So the audience was actually in this, square thing. And then there was this space where all the laughs would get sucked down. But it paid, and it was one of the first outside of Boston gigs that we had in the 80s that we went on the road for, as it were.
Well, that's pretty cool. People don't realize this, but Boston has a pretty large scene for comedians. I mean, what were your early days like?
I was in the room when Stephen Wright got picked up for The Tonight Show. History of that was there was two clubs at the time, the Ding Ho Chinese restaurant in Cambridge, Mass., which where Stephen was. And then there was another club in downtown Boston across from or outside of the theater district in the back room of the Charles Playhouse called the Comedy Connection. And so those were the two open mics that I started in. And I was pretty much on the ground floor. There was a great Showtime documentary called When Stand Up Stood Out, produced by a fellow comic who started in those days, and he's now, I think he's vice president of content for the Golf Channel / NBC Sports thing or something. His name is Franz Solomita, but if you look up Showtime thing, it's When Stand Up Stood Out. So it was pretty much the ground floor of the early 80s, 81, 82, and those two clubs existed, and then it grew, and the boom of the 80s, late 80s, every mom, pa, this was before karaoke, and every corner bar had a comedy night, and we could all make money, and it was a wonderful, wonderful thing. Then it grew even more. There was a comedy club called Stitches that started a lot of, actually, Bill Burr talked about being there. God, I just heard a bunch of guys that I was like, I didn't realize he started there. Oh, the guy from Saturday Night Live who just got the Mark Twain Award. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of New Hampshire and Boston guys. So there was Stitches, the Comedy Connection, Played Again, Sam's was another one. But there was about 4 full-time clubs. Nick's Comedy Stop was another one. 4 full-time clubs at the height of it. And the headliners like Lenny Clark, Steve Sweeney, Don Gavin, Dennis Leary, they could do 4 or 5 shows in a night. I was doing it. I was just starting to get paid. And I think the most I ever did, I think, was 3 shows in one night. And that just, especially when you only have 20 minutes, as I did in the early days, I was the middler. If you were opening, you had 5 or 10 minutes. And if you were middle, you had 20 to a half hour. And then if you were the headliner, you had 45 minutes to an hour.
Wow.
And the weird thing is that Boston, again, it stood on its own in that we had a different system in that it was the Lenny Clark show, and he was actually the host. And then he would bring up the other guys. It works out a lot better than now the comedy clubs have
An MC,
an opener, a middle, and a headline. And the MCs gets paid the least, and he's probably the worst guy. And he's got one of the most important jobs, to get the audience warmed up, get them relaxed, get them in the mood. But in Boston, it worked out well because you had the most experienced, the funniest guy right up front. He would open with like 15, make sure the crowd was hot, and then bring on the opener.
That's awesome. You mentioned Stephen Wright in the Chinese restaurant. It made me think, what is it on Route 1? Is it Kowloon's?
Oh, Kowloon's. Yeah, that's still there.
Yeah.
Yep, and that's actually, I think it's just about to close. Did it just close? Yeah, they're turning into condos. But up the street on the southbound side in Saugus is Giggles Comedy Club,
Yeah.
and
that's the Leaning House of Pizza.
yes, exactly. And that's run by Lenny Clark's brother, Mike Clark, who's a great comedy producer in New England too.
It's funny to me how these restaurants are the ones that have these comedy shows.
Oh yeah, you'll hear a lot of guys out of Boston talk about there was a proliferation of Chinese restaurants that would have comedy, and in Worcester, in Stoughton, and I'm trying to think of where else. Manchester, New Hampshire had a few of them too. You're like, what is it about the Asian management that decided to bring in?
They know what brings people in.
Well, and it was a cash business.
Oh yeah, there you go. You didn't think about it that way.
Yeah, exactly.
So, when you were starting and doing these open mics, how was that for you? I mean, how long did it take you to develop your own voice?
Well, I was lucky in that I never had the nerve to say I would do it. Well, I kind of did. I was starting behind the bar. I was a bartender, and that's a natural stage. My idol was George Carlin, and I knew that his bio, he did radio, and then he did stuff. So when I went off to college, the only thing I wanted was a student radio station, and I played soccer at the time. So that was the only 2 qualifications I wanted of a college. And the irony is that after my first year, my school dropped both the radio station and the soccer team.
Of course.
And they didn't rebuild the radio station until my senior year. So I went from tending bar to then hooking up with another bartender buddy of mine. And he and I would hold court behind the bar. And then we had friends up in North Conway that were singer-songwriters, and they were doing open mic nights. And, of course, that was the age of Linda Ronstadt and James Taylor and Billy Joel and all that. So when the guys got tired of hearing the 19th version of Fire and Rain, they started writing their own stuff. So they had a comedy sort of open mic night up in North Conway, and two of them had come down and performed at the bar that we worked at because my cohort was booking the entertainment, and they said, "Why don't you come up to North Conway and be part of our show?" So long story longer, I got to be part of a sketch group. We called ourselves the Boffo Players, vaudeville for the post-atomic era.
And what was that like?
That was a bunch of original songs and sketches, some really good, some really bad. The singer-songwriter and I had a thing for puppets because I used to be able to work puppets very well. And to this day on stage, I call myself a ventriloquist because I can't hide my lips, but I can move my hands exactly my voice. So I had a bunch of puppets. We turned into some dirty songs with great songs like Think of Me When You're Under Him. And it was a puppet and the guitar player. The one I really loved was What She's Sitting There with That Fucking Jerk When She Could Be Here With Me.
Nice.
So and they all had like a country twang to them, which was real nice. Anyway, so I was part of a sketch group, and out of that, I wrote a thing that got me into comedy when I had the nerve to finally move down to Boston. I wrote a 5-minute condensed version of The Wizard of Oz. And that was my entry into open mic nights. It was a blessing and a curse because it always worked because I did all the voices, but it always worked. So I never knew what it was to fail. And it took me like 2 years. It took another comedian headliner guy, great guy named DJ Hazard, came up to me afterwards after about doing this for a year at open mics and said, "All right, that works. Now write some more," because I was going
now do something else.
Yeah, now do so. So I eventually got enough so I could open and middle and do all that. But not that I never bombed, because there was times, like I say, that you were in every Tom, Dick, and Harry bar. We were standing underneath dartboards some nights, and turn off the Bruins, and the place would go nuts. And now it's time for comedy, and they'd start throwing shit right away.
Especially this time of year.
Yeah. So you always had, the hell gigs. But as far as my own sets, I always had that ace in the hole to pull out. And at the same time, the bookers knew that would work. So when they first opened a room, a VFW hall or another Chinese restaurant, they'd send me and another guy who ended up being one of my best friends. He did magic comedy. So I did the voices, he did the sight things. So the two of us would go, jump on the bomb before they send in the real good guys.
That's pretty cool. So you're developing your own voice over this period of time, and you're developing an act. So you get past that initial Wizard of Oz piece. At that point, did you find you were facing any challenges?
Oh, yeah. There was and I guess the hardest part, and this is to this day why I did get on national TV with that Wizard of Oz bit. But again, it was my curse because I didn't really I allowed all the voices in my head to, talk me down. And there was the thing I write in my bio is that Boston was such a great place. I mean, you look at some of the great comedians that came out of that because they just demanded an original voice, and if you had anything near what they call hacky, a joke that anybody, like I remember used to do a joke about the black box on the airplanes. And my line was, black box, they're always looking for a black box. Why don't they build wings on that thing and make that fly? Good joke, and it makes it laugh. And I remember headliners coming up to me and go, "You got to get rid of that black box joke." I go, "Why?" Because it's hack. Everybody does, some sort of black box joke. So they really did demand, and I never really found, because I did voices, I did some observational and self-deprecating stuff. My claim to fame, my website is TTTOMTALKS, Tom Talks, because my moniker that Boston kind of gave me, I was the Mel Tillis of comedy, because like Mel, I stuttered off the mic, but when I got on the mic, I didn't stutter that bad. But the real true story, and to this day, I still do the joke. Every time I go to a restaurant, order a tuna fish sandwich, I get 2 of them. And that's happened to me as a child and right up to adulthood, then I always have to explain that to the crowd because people go, "What?" I go, "To tuna fish." Remember, I just say, "Can I have a tuna fish sandwich?" "Oh, you get 2 of them." So finding my own voice, and actually I was lucky enough. I was booking a show in Kennebunkport, and in the late 80s, early 90s, before anybody ever heard of the town Kennebunkport, before the Bushes moved in. And at that point, there was almost nothing being booked north of Boston, maybe a couple of Manchester, New Hampshire, and Concord, maybe, but definitely not in the state of Maine. And I got up there and did a couple of shows, and one bar saw that, they had a real nice showroom, and they ended up hiring Jay Leno to come in, and only because his agent called. He came up to bury his uncle, and he was in Andover, and he said, I want a gig, call around. And so they hired him. And I sat down with Jay at the bar and he knew, he's a North Andover, Mass boy. Yep. So he knew all the guys from Boston, Lenny Clark and Steve Sweeney and Stephen Wright and all that. And he goes, you guys are spoiled. You're all getting paid so well. He goes, if you want to make it, you got to be in New York or LA. And that was his first thing. And then he said, and the hardest point is to find your own voice, to get your own writers. It's called POV, your point of view, and I never really found that until I segued 10, 15 years ago into my main character.
So did you do that all on your own, or did you have any sort of help?
That was pretty much all my own, because it's when you see everything and how it all works, you're realizing, all right, I'm thinking. That was the other thing I was talking about with the voices inside my head. Impressionists and magic guys and prop guys in Boston were not held in high esteem.
No, it's never the same.
Yeah, and so I shunned away from my strength was impressions, and there was a huge guy when I started out named Joe Alasky, who ended up out in L.A. and then also Tom Kinney from SpongeBob SquarePants. He moved down from New York because his best friend was Bobcat Goldthwait, and they had voices. And as soon as they got secure in that, they moved to LA, and Joe ended up dubbing over some of the Lost Honeymooners videos because the audio got screwed up, and he did such a great Jackie Gleason. I think it was like the family okayed him to do a Gleason voice on those old tapes.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So if I had the nerve, I would have stayed with and gone out to LA and done all the cartoons, and especially now I got a gig up here. I was the voices for the Maine State Lottery. We did the scratch tickets, and I had that gig for almost 2 years, where everything had a character. My best one, they had to put on a disclaimer on. We had a Jacks Are Wild, so I did my Jack Nicholson voice, and the whole day I was doing Jack Nicholson, and I told him, I was like, do you want a real cartoon Jack, or do you just want laid back Jack? So I was doing that almost 3 hours in the studio, and I'm driving back in my car with a Jack just stuck in my head. But with that one, they had to put a disclaimer, voice impression by, and I was like, can't you put Tom Clark? And they're like, no, we just put a voice actor. So I was like, damn.
No credit.
Yeah, no credit.
Well, you were talking about it too, and it's one of my favorite things about Boston is we get so many comedians come out of Boston. I mean, big comedians.
Oh, yeah.
And you're working with these people. Did any of them become any sort of mentor for you?
Yes and no, because the other thing is that all the guys that I started with in the 80s, and I say this on stage, I got into it for the wine, women, and song. And I said, that's waxing poetic. And in honesty, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And the 80s was a pretty crazy time. And you were doing the drugs with the guys and all that. And now all those guys, there's more AA meetings going on after clubs than there are guys going out and partying. So I became, somewhat partying with guys. But with that, I now haven't had a drink or drug in actually this week is my 26th year.
Very nice.
And there's a lot of us. So that mindset, that disease is sort of stops you from real bonding, except for the party bonding. So I don't think I had a mentor. There was guys, like I said, my magic comedian friend who ended up being my roommate. We still see each other. We're both, actually his son and my daughter are almost the same age. And he lives in upstate New York now. So there was guys that I watched grow, and then I saw. But as far as anybody taking me under their wing or me looking for advice, because that's the thing about stand-up is that you're your own writer, director, producer. There's guys that I know are so much funnier than the guys you see on TV, but they didn't have either the business thing or the balls to take the chance, the risk.
That's what I'm wondering too. Is I love doing it, but I would never, at my stage of life, I would never go out and risk everything by moving to LA or New York and trying to make it. Not the type of thing you can do with a family. But you just mentioned something that's very important, and that's the fact that you're the one writing, directing, and producing your own career. So when you're putting these jokes together, how do they come to you? Is it something that you're just observant?
Well, we all have our own creative process. For me, and I'm kind of lazy, and I think that shows in my career because there are guys that have the discipline. Some of the great one-liner guys that I started out with, one was the head writer for Conan O'Brien, Brian Kiley, who's just writes brilliant stuff. And another guy, Bill Broaddus, was a good friend, and he just wrote and helped produce Steve Sweeney's film, Sweeney Killing Sweeney. Those guys sit down and write like 300 jokes a day, and then see where it goes. Mine was more ambling sort of things that, like the 2 tuna fish sandwich thing. One of the other ones that has a real clear voice. I had a nice thing about cutting my toenails on my front step. True story. I watched an ant carrying away my big toenail. Then I just exaggerate.
Right.
Yeah, there's stuff like that. I've looked into classes and I've seen how some people dissect and can write jokes like that. But to me, it's got to come from almost somewhere else. Your ilk, your voice. It has to be yours, and contrived. I mean, there's a place for it. Comedy writers, and I did a couple of stints on morning radio. I was the voice guy. Then another guy hired me in Boston to be a writer, and I couldn't write in his voice. I only lasted like six months, I think. But then I was commuting from Maine into Boston.
Wow.
There's a place for all that. But as far as pure stand-up, there's guys that are lucky that they find exactly who they are right off the bat. I think of Bill Burr. If you look at old Bill Burr stuff, I mean, he was ballsy from the get-go. And although he claims, I knew he started in Boston, and then I looked at some of his early stuff, and I was like, wait a minute, he was the kid that, and we did work the same clubs and the same open mic, but he was this skinny red-haired kid. And he said he was just terrible, and he didn't have that ranting, that angst, and it took him a while to find his voice, and now his beauty is that he isn't afraid to say anything.
No, he's not. And what kills me too is, like, you talk about people like Stephen Wright, not quite one-liners, but pretty close. And I wouldn't have the memory to remember all of those.
Oh yeah,
because
I tell stories. I used to have like a drunk, and I'd write it in my set list, drunk driving bit, and and it was more of a story about how I got stopped for drunk driving, and again exaggerating the whole thing, or growing up as the last of 6 kids and being picked on, and again. So yeah, that was more stories, and the other weird thing with comedy is it works against you, especially with the success of the '80s and at the clubs. What we were trying to do is get more time, because the more time you had, the more money you could make. But it didn't really adhere to that as far as fame goes, because to really get famous, you had to get as Jay had told me, and then other guys you had to have your TV 5 minutes, your TV 8, and that had to be clean, and it had to be boom, and it was boom, 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 and that's how you got to be on TV. So. And there were a couple of guys, Jack Gallagher out of Boston, he moved to San Francisco, and then he had a great one-man show where he talked about how he sat down and watched the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, got to know who they put on and what kind of jokes, and he started to write those kind of jokes when he was out on the West Coast and get his 8 minutes down. And he crushed his first time, and he was asked back like right away. And then he said he got lazy and he didn't write as hard, and he didn't have it, and they were just like, there you go, kid. So yeah, there's all kinds of ways to get into it, and all kinds of disciplines but basically, and it almost goes against who we are as freewheeling creative types. but you got to be disciplined in some aspect of it, whether it be the business, returning the phone calls. Now it's all social media. So you got to get out on those platforms and all that. There's all kinds of ways to do it.
My inspiration, I always liked Louis C.K.
Yeah.
I liked that style of joke, more storytelling about my own life. I mean, I feel bad for my wife, but I pretty much abuse my wife when I'm telling jokes, and my kids, the same type of thing. But that's the only way I could remember them, is by remembering stories from my own life and try to identify something to go along with that. But I took my wife to a concert last week or the week before, and we went to see Bert Kreischer. Oh my God, he was hilarious. I've never seen my wife laugh so hard. And they're true stories from his life that he just rattles on, and you would think he would run out at some point, but he never does. Amazing. If you haven't checked him out, you should at least look him up. He's hilarious.
That's the other thing of because the guy in Boston who just opened up for Bill Burr in Fenway Park, kind of a Boston legend now, Tony V. And it goes back to that point of view. Once you find your voice, then anything's funny, because all of a sudden you know where you're coming from, and you just see this the guy delivering water or oil or something to your house, and there's some little weird thing, and that little slant that kicks in. And actually, to get to that is now with my main character, I do Mr. C.L. Thomas, and it's just a dry Maine humor, and bam, I know exactly where he's coming from. I don't get the stage fright I always used to get, and I'd always go, well, Elvis was great. I feel so secure in this character when I get into him that boom, I just know it's going to be a good time, and I know exactly. Once you find your voice, anything becomes funny.
Two things you mentioned there, finding your voice in anything can be funny. Even my wife and I today, my kid had dance class. So we went to Wendy's for dinner, just in between her two classes. And we got the 1-year-old and my 8-year-old back in the car. And we walked around from the passenger side to the driver's side. And I remember that Louis C.K. joke in my head where that's his mini vacation once you get the kids in the car. And I said that to my wife, I didn't even think she would get it, but I just said, up, and our vacation starts. But she knew it. We walked around the car, said goodbye and everything. But just that connection, that memory of that was funny to me. But you were talking about a character. And first, let me ask you, do you prefer stand-up versus character or character versus stand-up?
I'd say hindsight 2020, I'm better at the character. I got to be the character because I did the stand-up. But I didn't have my own voice doing stand-up. And stand-up is so raw, and you can sort of adjust. Like if they don't buy into my character, I'm screwed. But I haven't run into where they haven't bought into it, just because now I know where not to go. I'm not doing the open mics at a bowling alley anymore with this character. I just had a great theater show, and I've got another one coming up next week, this Sunday, actually back in North Conway where it all started.
Well, tell me more about that. Tell me about the character and what you're doing with the character.
Well, geez, I'll tell you what there, Mr. J. See, what I am, my name is C.L. Thomas, and I come from a place called Cape Cove Harbor, Maine. That's for you flatlanders out in the Midwest there. You may not know the difference. A cape, a cove, and a harbor, that's about pretty much the same thing. It's just a matter of size, A smaller one is you get Cape Cod, but you get harbors in Cape. Anyway, so and there are folks in the state of Maine, believe it or not, that talk exactly like this, and I've had it time and time again. So I just decided I call it's Tom Clark's alter ego, and I do a show called Tourists, Teenagers, Technology, and Other Things That Ain't Right. There you go, Jay. That's how I get it.
That is too funny. So when you're doing this and you say you come up with something new, give me an example of just a process of yours. I mean,
that was the other thing you're talking about, one-liners and stories telling. I always say that there's, or it's not an original thought, but there's two types of humor where you get the old storytellers. Unfortunately, we got to bring them up as when I was a kid, Bill Cosby. And he was always, talking about why is there air and all this. They're sleeping in the bed with your brother. And that was the, oh, yeah, kind of humor, because we've all been there. Sort of what CL just did, Then you get your favorite, Stephen Wright, as opposed to the, oh yeah, you get, huh? Where did he think of that? I mean, one of Stephen's greatest one-liners is, I like to ice skate, but on the other side of the ice. It's like, who thinks it like that, you know?
Right. Put my car keys in the house and my house started.
Started up the house, yeah.
So I took
Drove
it for a
around
ride.
the block for a while. Yeah, so there's those two different kinds of humor, of that ones that everybody can recognize and one that goes, holy shit, this guy's off the wall. How did he think of that?
So do you find, you mentioned starting in stand-up and developing the characters. Is that how your career has developed, more into the character now than stand-up?
Yeah, because the other part is I'm getting old. I ain't the young kid anymore, and I really wasn't doing for. I love to drink and party and mingle with the ladies after the show and all that. But I got married and bought a house and had a child, and especially now, I don't have a whole lot to say to the kids that come out to comedy clubs. And I know there's guys my age that do talk about, you can still write jokes about, being married and all that, but I don't know if I'm too scared to bring up my personal life, to use it as bare bones as Louis C.K. or Bill Burr does, that just puts it right out there. There's some stuff I don't want to share. I'm not that brave. Those guys that are the stars, that's why they're the stars. When Louis C.K. called his daughter the C word, you're like, oh my God.
Yep. And who was the other one? Oh, Robert Schimmel.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Oh, Lord in heaven above, the things he would talk about.
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, the other one who passed, Dennis Kronberg, he was the first one to do a colonoscopy joke on The Tonight Show. And it was just because he had this really, Dennis Griff, he died of cancer. Because there's no limits now, It's just as long as you can, make it funny.
Well, I think that's it. I mean, we're talking about Louis C.K. and Robert Schimmel. Robert Schimmel didn't even start till he was 50. And he was pushing the boundaries with the types of jokes he was telling. Now you could hear those types of jokes on any stage, anywhere you go.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, it's a different time, I guess, but he was hilarious. And he would talk about his wife and his daughter and the fact that he had cancer and stuff. He was completely open and honest. I mean, I like to think I have no problem, talking about my wife or kids and giving them a hard time. But, I mean, he was telling the deepest, darkest.
I had a whole childbirth routine because my wife did have an emergency C-section. And then I had that and breastfeeding and how she couldn't breastfeed and asking me if, do you want to come to the breastfeeding class? And my line was like, no, I'm pretty sure they're your tits. That's, you can leave me out of this. But then I had this whole thing about breastfeeding and seeing it. And at one point on the stage, we were just talking this because friends came over the house after this last show I did this weekend. And I said, oh yeah, I got my wife so angry at me one time because as a stand-up, my breastfeeding joke, I talked about how the electric pump got her nipples 5 inches long. And the line was, I said, my wife had something on the end of her breast, not unlike a night crawler, ladies and gentlemen. and I made the mistake of pointing her out in the crowd one night when she had come to the show. And she crawled up one side of me and down the other because it was funny, but, she didn't need to be, because then, she's walking around after the show, everybody's staring at her chest, or the idiot's coming up, are your nipples really that big?
Yeah.
It's just like you don't, so I sort of drew a line, but I don't know.
Oh, mercy.
Still have fun with
my wife won't go anywhere around me when I'm doing these things.
yeah.
No, she hates it. She hates every last minute of it.
Yeah.
But I just can't help it. I mean, my wife's from Tennessee. I'm from Boston, and we met in Tennessee. I worked there for 20 years. That's where we met. I was working in the music business, producing records, and she was doing the album covers for people.
Oh.
But totally different sense of humor and the way our families grew up and stuff. It was brutal. I could tell you story after story of the way I tortured that woman when I took her home to meet my family and stuff. Oh, it was brutal. I mean, I'll tell you a quick one. We drove up 95 to get to Boston and stopped in New Jersey, and I called my mother and I was like, look, I'd taken her home to meet you and everything, but I told her that everybody from Boston, they want a hug. And she's like, yeah. I said, and then they'll grab your ass a little bit, give you a little squeeze, and then they'll want to give you a kiss and all this stuff. And she's like, no way. And I just kept layering it on worse and worse by the time we got to Boston. And my mother came to the door and gave her a hug, squeezed her ass, laid one on her. And she looks at me like, I can't believe it's true. And then I had every sick uncle and everybody in my family was enjoying that. Nice. But I want to take a minute here. I know you put an album together, and that's something that fascinates me. Can you tell me a little bit about your album?
Well, I got lucky. The one, because where I live now, it's called the Seacoast. I'm in Elliott, Kittery, Maine, and it's right across the street from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, right across the river. And Portsmouth is a pretty cool hotbed of the arts. And I got to know a couple of guys. Actually, the cover there, that's actually a road trip I was on doing clubs in Florida. Those trees to the right are orange trees. And I got out and I just took the picture. I mean, it just was flat and it would just kept going. So I went in and this was when CDs were coming out and everybody had, so I actually kind of cheated. I went in with a buddy of mine who had his own studio, and I had already had a video of my appearance on Evening at the Improv. And then I made a video of the comedy. The best club in Maine was the Comedy Connection in Portland, Maine. And they were very professional. And again, this was not when they had almost all the clubs now have a built-in video system. And, you just stream it live and bam, you get the thumb drive or they just emailed the entire thing. Like I just had this past weekend, a guy just emailed me my show. I was like, wow. I did a video set of in the 90s of the Comedy Connection, because the problem is I had friends that were trying to do it the way, you would do an album, but it's a real roll of dice and it's a big chunk of money. I mean, you're bringing in a sound engineer and it's a roll of dice because the crowd's not always there. The crowd's not always, even mine, the one I did, there was two girls that were, because the crowd was mic'd, which is a real important thing, because this last show I did, the sound was all through the board on the stage mic. So the laughs were there, but you can't really hear it. I can't really use that as a promo because you can't hear the good laughs that I was getting. So this club was mic'd with the audience. It was cool, except these two loudmouth girls were right underneath the mic. So there's a couple of bits that you hear them. Oh, that was really funny, Harry. At least the way she was doing. And you're like, oh, shut up.
Well, at least they're not saying how bad it was.
Right. Yeah. So I cheated that way. I sort of, but then I did the other CD I did was the of my character, and that's on the website too. If you scroll down in the merchandise, I believe. There's C.L. Thomas. And that I went in and I did it. It was an old hats off to sort of the radio guys. And I don't know if you know much of Down East humor. When it started, there was a guy called Bert and I. They did the old stories that you would read in a book. So I went into my friend's studio and just with no audience, just did it like, I called it a hats off to what you'd hear around the general store and the fire, the wood stove. And these guys, these old Mainers just trading stories.
So how hard was that for you to do without an audience?
Pretty goddamn hard. It was, luckily, like I said, the engineer really liked me and liked this stuff. Well, you do have a different kind of energy. It's not the performance. Well, it's a performance energy, but it's a different sort when you're trying to tell a story. And there'd be times I'd hear it and I was pretty particular about myself and say, no, I'm not getting the accent right, or I dropped the character, let's try that again. But that was more challenging than I expected, let's say. But I'm real proud of that. I really like that CD. It holds up and it's, like I say, it's true to the it's a throwback to what the old Mainers were, just sitting around the Norman Rockwell picture, of sitting around the general store
shop.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So you're in the studio. You said it was a friend of yours?
Yeah, actually, he's produced a bunch of singer-songwriters around here. His name is Rick Watson, and he produced a guy, Cormac McCarthy, not the author, but and he's a pretty nationally recognized singer-songwriter, and a couple of other guys. So they, I had full confidence in his mixing and all that.
So you're in there, no audience. Are you treating him as your one-on-one audience?
Yes and no, only because I was more interested in staying in the character than getting the laughs, because I knew it wasn't a live performance, so the laughs weren't. I just had to be true to the story. That's why I say it was more of a exercise in acting. And at that point, I had done enough voice-over work. You talk about engineering albums and stuff. I don't know if you ever did radio or voice-over work, but I did a lot of that. And for those that don't know, voice over, you say, oh, you just read the script and boom, how hard is that? And it's just like, well, it's really hard. I had, you're doing a 30-second spot and they've written an hour and a half of copy for you to read. And I remember the weirdest one I had was, like I say, it was a 30-second spot and we kept going over. So they said, could you speed up the read but slow down the words? And because we were going over, I understood kind of what he meant. And I was like, all right, it's just taking less breaths in between the words. And because you're getting, when you're doing a 30-second spot, you're getting into the minutia of, everything that you're saying. And then you run into the other story I always tell. I was doing a furniture spot and the guy had an Andy Rooney. And I used to do a pretty decent Andy Rooney impersonation, and the copywriter. That's the other thing, because they got the client, then you got the copywriter who wrote the copy, and they want all the information in there. Then they want the jokes, and now I'm on top of it. I'm doing the impression. So I'm like, would you ever bother you when you go in and buy your living room furniture, and it's just not right? Well, this guy, I ended up literally doing about 50 takes. We were in the booth for about 45 minutes. No, it's just not right. And at this point, I knew the engineer. It was at a local radio station that I did a lot of work at. And he was rolling his eyes. I was rolling my eyes. The client's just going, no, it's not right. Finally, he lets out this huff and goes, I got to take a break. This whole idea of Andy Rooney was my sister's idea, and I hate Andy Rooney. And he walks out of the studio, and we're just like, pal, what are you doing? You give me the money. Let us burn the money for you, because that's what you're doing. You're wasting everybody's time here. So yeah, the whole idea of voice acting was sort of entrenched. And so by the time I got to do that, the character, it was kind of fun. So when you're doing that character and you're in the studio, are you flying in laugh tracks? Or are you doing anything to enhance it? No, not that one. Not on that disc. That was all, like I said, it's pretty much a radio show. It was just me talking to him. And it was an acting exercise in that, I sort of had to picture him around the thing. You may not understand that, but and the weird thing is I'm in the middle of turning that into a book, and I had the whole thing. I gave it to a stenographer, and she put it all down in words. But it took me, unfortunately, a couple of years to realize it's a different medium. What you're saying and what you read, how much the accent translates. So I ran into a whole other ball of wax there. That's got to be tough too. I mean, it's the editing process. Like I said, it's been in the works for at least 2 years now. I thought I was going to get it done this winter, and now I'm still looking at it like it doesn't read. And it took another comedian, character comedian, a woman up here that said, "Oh yeah, you can't do what is said is not the same as what's written," because she'd done a book, and she goes, "No, you can't write in the accent. You have to do it still, and it's a different medium." Yeah, you don't write the way you speak. You don't speak the way you write. Right, exactly. So dealing with that conundrum now is that the stage in my art now. Up to this point, do you have any memory that stands out? Well, doing the national TV spot, Evening at the Improv, I got flown out to the Improv Club on Melrose because I have the downtown club. And so I had to go in and do the show that night in their downtown club. And Jay Leno was up in the balcony talking to Bud Friedman. All of a sudden, Jerry Seinfeld was in the bar, but the performance room was out back. And I was on with everybody on the billing had TV credits except for me. So that was the night before. Then you go into they tape it in the afternoon, and I'm just a bundle of nerves, and it's the club, and it's a live show. But the weirdest thing that I always tell the story is that every comedian there is just a batch of nerves and doing all this, and the guy comes up and goes, "Oh, by the way," right before he goes, "Don't worry about your taping. We sweeten the tape after we video." Which means they drop in a laugh track.
Right.
You're like, oh my God. So I was like, well, this whole big thing's a farce.
Well, that's what I'm wondering about, right? You're putting these albums together and you're doing things like this, and people don't understand. You got to repeat lines. You got to do things over, especially when you're doing it in the studio without an audience. It doesn't have that same energy.
Oh, yeah. You've got to come up and match the energy.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's vocal acting as opposed to the performance. And I just read a great thing about performance. I heard it on one of those variety magazine talk shows on YouTube now. The audience is unpredictable, whereas you are not. So you've got to be able to go in, dig into your own well every time and come up with the goods, because there's no guarantee that the audience is going to be there. So as long as you put out the best that you can, then you can walk away.
I think that's the beauty of the open mic is you're dealing with a room of, 5 or 6 tables, and if that, you're not going to get laughter. You're going to get a bunch of stone faces just staring back at you.
Well, that was you talked. So the pinnacle. So I'm out in LA taping my first national appearance. My second time on stage in New York City at the comic strip. The first time I brought like 8 of my friends. I didn't have the Wizard of Oz. I played music on my teeth, and I did an echo thing in my voice, and I think I did an Ed Sullivan impression. And the guy said to me, "I want to see you again. Come back next week." And back then, you had to stand in line on a Tuesday for the Friday night spot and all this. So the next time I come back, and I'm thinking, all this, I got my 8 minutes. He goes, "I'd like to see you again without all your friends and see how you go." So I did the exact same stuff, but it was 2:00 in the morning. I was like, because you're drawing numbers out of the hat. The first show I got the third spot, which is like the catbird seat. So the second show I do 2 a.m. There's 8 drunks there, and I have to follow a duo that we paid our college to come up and perform at our college. So I'm following pros that I've already seen. And they ripped the room apart with only 6 or 8 folks there. And then I go up there and play music on my teeth. And this guy, and so I know I bombed. And the guy says, "Oh, I would like to see you with new stuff." And I said, you said come back and you wanted to see me without the crowd. There's the lowest and the high of when you're starting off and you're getting kicked in the nuts.
Well, I watch this show now, Kill Tony, where he brings people up on stage and gives them 1 minute to do new material each week. You just don't understand how much effort it goes into writing just 1 minute worth of material. I don't understand how people can do that and feel comfortable, not working it out, not doing any of that stuff.
Yeah, I don't know if comfort even comes into it. I don't think I think that's the whole rub of it is that it's not comfortable, and that's his hook. Kill Tony. I've heard about that. I've never seen it, but it was like, oh, these guys, some of them are just great, and some just get ripped apart, and all that. And it's like. My standard line is like, I stutter, so I can't even say hello in 1 minute.
Well, I mean, I've seen the show quite a bit at this point, and they're now doing it at Joe Rogan's new studio, the Mothership in Austin. Oh. And I mean, Tony is good. I've seen his act. He's a good comedian, and I think he's, as much as he picks on the people that come up, because that's what they're there for. That's the fun of it all.
They're fodder, yeah.
But I still think he's lenient, and they get these guest comedians come on, and I see some people that are just horrible, and they'll say, "Oh no, I think you got a good foundation there," and some of them I'm like, "Really? That was a good foundation?" And then some of them will just be really bad, and they'll just let them know, that wasn't good.
Then that's the other thing. Even as good as people get, humor is still subjective. I remember working at this bar, and I said, "Hey, I'm going to do a show. Why don't you come down and see it?" This couple that were always at this bar, and the girl actually said, "Oh no, I don't like comedians." I go, "What do you mean you don't like comedians?" She goes, "Well, that whole idea that two guys walk into a bar, no, or a nun and a priest walk into a bar, that never happens." And I was like, "Wow, you can't suspend that whole belief thing." I said, "You must have no." And I looked at her husband. I went, "Wow, she doesn't have any." He goes, "No, she's a very serious woman." I was like, "I'm so sorry for you, sir." But yeah, funny. So there's guys that don't get Stephen right. Just he's too dry. You're just like nobody would ever skate on the other side of the ice. That's silly.
Well, we do this thing at the end of the show where we like to shine some light on what we call an unsung hero. Do you have anybody that you'd like to shine a little light on, give a little credit to?
Actually, the part I didn't speak of is that my 25-year-old daughter tried stand-up.
Oh, really?
And she was doing it at her high school. She did a couple of coffee shops, and then the music director there, who was a singer-songwriter, he had a show, and he invited her to be on it. And she had this really cool sorority girl, sort of. And I was like, that's the voice. And she actually did 2 shows with me. She opened for me. And so I think my hat would have to be off to her, that she gets it, that she understood she's part of my blood. And my wife just shakes her head and then like, no, because at one point she was pretty serious about wanting to be a comedian, but then she had a great thing of when she bombed one time at her college. She got hired to open for this guy who was this softball or hotshot baseball player guy. And she just bombed. And she said, "Dad, it was like running your head into a wall and expecting cushions, and it was concrete." She still wants to be, she's still a great writer. And, but she's, she didn't, and she saw what I go through, the whole having your self-esteem tied into a room full of strangers is a kind of quirky way to spend a life.
Well, that's awesome. I can't wait till she's out there enough so we can go see her.
Well, I shine my light on her just because there's things that she has taught me that I can look at it in hindsight and go, wow, you picked up on that years. You were, of course I was involved with drinking and chasing skirts, and right. She picked up on it in her 3rd time on stage. She goes, "Oh, if I paused here and I did this and I did that," I'm like, "You already knew it. You already know that." And then she's like, "Well, Dad, I watched you," because she worked the door for me the first year I came up with the character show. And the character show I actually did, I opened for myself. I did 20 minutes of my stand-up, and then I'd turn into the character.
Well, you mentioned something else in there, too, just real quick. You mentioned the singer-songwriters and that connection between comedians and singer-songwriters, that they're always in the same venues and they're always kind of, intertwined a little bit, even opening for each other.
Oh, yeah. Well, I helped the guy that I teamed up with in our Waffle Players in our sketch group. Actually, he went on to be the poet laureate of Rhode Island, and he's now a published poet. He teaches poetry and English at Bryant College in Rhode Island. But I went to see him during the couple of years that we were all doing stuff, but he had his solo gigs. And I watched him, and sometimes he would just get into his stool and, just keep playing, because he did all original songs. And his name was Tom, too. And I was like, "Tom, you got to get off that stool. You think you're just by yourself in the corner of the bar, but if you want their attention," he goes, "Well, they suck." I go, "I know they suck because you just climbed in yourself. Get off the stool and engage them." So they can hide behind the guitar, but when they're, especially him, he, like I said, his was all original songs, and then when they weren't buying into it, he took it a personal offense and would turn it down.
Right. Tom, sir, my friend, do you have any final words you'd like to leave us with?
Just thank you, and go to tomtalks.com to see where I'll be performing next. This Sunday I'll be at the Majestic Theater in Conway, New Hampshire, for a thing called the Cold River Radio Show.
Awesome.
And, that's kind of a Lake Wobegon show I'm being part of up there. Thank you very much for having me on, Jay. Nice chatting with you.
Now, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Tom is one funny guy, and what an amazing career. So please join me in giving a big thanks to Tom for joining us this week and sharing his stories. And thank you for taking the time to hang with me here this week. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. You can do that and find all the links to everything mentioned in this episode over at jfranze.com/episode 11. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next week.
This episode has been brought to you by VR Knives, your source for 100% custom knives made by a true rock star. So, if you're in the market for a new piece of art, reach out to VR Knives. 407-421-5528. 407-421-5528.